Hello, I'm Paul Zimmy Finn, and this is the Generation Report. To my knowledge, the convergence of ideas I discuss in this episode will be new. This is not meant to be a complete analysis of a complex historical development, but rather as one perspective on why a sea change in American history occurred, how it affects us in the present, and what, perhaps, we can do to turn the tide. The great proposition on which America was founded was that a nation of people granted the agency to pursue their own desires could also govern themselves. This hypothesis rested on the supposition that, in such a framework, families and communities would come together voluntarily to resolve their joint problems, and large institutions could act as facilitators of family and community well-being where that voluntarism reached its limits. While far from perfect, America did achieve a variation of this vision in the form of a civic culture which became renowned around the world. In his 2012 book, Coming Apart, Dr. Charles Murray identifies 4 founding virtues which define that civic culture: industriousness, honesty, religiosity, and marriage. Because each of these virtues was generally strong across classes, ethnicities, and territorial and state lines, America continually buttressed its reputation as the land of opportunity. To Dr. Murray's 4 founding virtues, I will add my own: generational compact. It was understood in America that each generation possessed an obligation to make communities strong, families prosperous, and to take actions that paved the way to a better future for the generations that followed. The compact among generations in any society reflects the objectives that society has for the present, the investments it has in the future, and its devotion to sustaining a shared identity. At the dawn of the 2020s, it would not be a stretch to say that, by these criteria, America has gone off track. In this episode, I will explain why America's generations drifted apart over the decades preceding our crisis, and how the atrophying of the once strong generational compact is reflected in the state of America today. It is admittedly a tricky business to place a value judgment on the changes to America's civic culture and its generational compact through time. Over much of America's past, when all the founding virtues were objectively more in evidence than they are today, gross inequities and cruel sanction prejudices abounded. Of course, it is my assertion that it would be a grave mistake to use those inequities and prejudices as justification to leave the best parts of our heritage behind. The compact among American generations is not dead, but it is in a state of acute and dangerous disrepair, and is possibly approaching total breakdown. Worse still, that development is accelerating amid a crisis era. As Benjamin Franklin said long ago, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Ah yes, freedom. It's the word responsible for more arguments between Americans than any other, isn't it? And it's no wonder. Even Merriam-Webster offers little clarity on its meaning. Freedom, it reads, quote, has a broad range of application from total absence of restraint to merely a sense of not being unduly hampered or frustrated, unquote. In order, then, to better understand the basis of the American framework as envisioned by the founders, and the American civic culture that emerged from that framework, we need to examine not freedom's definition, but its connotative application, as well as the connotative application of a similar high principle, liberty. Freedom and liberty are often used interchangeably, but in fact they have different applications. Freedom is a primarily interior condition which implies autonomy over one's self-essence, whereas liberty is a primarily exterior condition which implies being unimpeded in one's self-agency. The modifier famously used in the title of the proclamation that freed the slaves, emancipation, carries a decidedly exterior connotation. To emancipate is to, quote, free from restraint, control, or the power of another, unquote. This is a critical distinction. An institutional and social framework with freedom as its first principle can easily persuade individuals to pursue their own best interests, but it has a much harder time incentivizing them to continually consider common shared interests. By contrast, an institutional and social framework with liberty as its first principle can more easily incentivize individuals to continually consider personal and shared interests. If self-ownership within one's exterior surroundings matters more than the essence those surroundings give to the self, then each person's self-agency and well-being are more readily understood to be inseparable from the self-agency and well-being of others. My contention is that for most of American history, liberty, extending it, expanding it, modifying it, sustaining it, was the first principle of the nation's institutional and social framework, rather than freedom. Was this framework perfect? Of course not. Its basis in liberty, however, did achieve something important. The civic culture of the founding was sustained generation after generation, and consequently, the generational compact and other founding virtues were themselves maintained. So, what happened? There is no single answer, no date that marks a clear-cut before and after, but there are signs of when America underwent changes that hearkened to something different emerging. A major watershed was the Great Depression of the 1930s. The hardship and deprivation of that era were so immense and instilled so much fear that American institutions, as befitting a crisis, were transformed in response. I assert that response, however, effected a change which altered the basic objective of the American framework, from one which prioritized liberty as its first principle to one which prioritized freedom as its first principle. This shift from an exterior to interior first principle had enormous implications. Freedom is associated with internal feelings and desires, happiness, absence of anxiety and material deprivation, security. The New Deal reflected the desire of millions of Americans, recognized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration, to be institutionally insured from existential dreads in daily life, and to live in an essence that gave them assurances to that effect. You can see this dynamic in several contexts from that era. A few examples briefly. In his 1933 inaugural address, President Roosevelt not only declared Americans had nothing to fear but fear itself, he also spoke of, quote, the joy of achievement, the thrill of creative effort, and moral stimulation of work, unquote. 8 years later, in his 1941 State of the Union address, FDR proposed his 4 freedoms, which famously included the freedom from want and the freedom from fear. But this focus on the interior extended far beyond the rhetoric of a transformative democratic president. In a famous 1941 Life magazine essay, The American Century, renowned conservative and FDR critic Henry Luce spoke of the state of America on the eve of its entry into World War II in these terms. Quote, we Americans are unhappy. We are not happy about America. We are not happy about ourselves in relation to America. This nation cannot truly endure unless there courses strongly through its veins the blood of purposes and enterprise and high resolve, the triumphal purpose of freedom, unquote. Freedom appears 14 times in the text of the American Century. Liberty does not appear once. This shift from liberty to freedom, from the external to the internal, was a critical break from one of the core tenets of American life since the founding, the understanding that each person's well-being rested in their devotions to vocation, family, and community. Once the entire New Deal became entrenched in American institutional and social life, vocation, family, and community began to lose their essential basis as the domains where that well-being resided. In their place, the new individual protections from want and fear took over. In the face of such a seismic shift, social behavior was bound to change, including the behavior of generations both individually and toward one another. At the forefront of the changes would be the generation coming of age amid the years of transition. Among all the assertions and observations Luce makes in the American Century, here is one which has been largely overlooked. Quote, we start into this war with huge government debt, a vast bureaucracy, and a whole generation of young people trained to look to the government as the source of all life, unquote. He was referring to the GI generation. Civic and constructive and collectivist by temperament since they were small children, the GIs had grown up and were passing through young adulthood as FDR and the New Deal transformed the relationship between government and the American people. Luce correctly observed the affinity this generation had for the institutions of the new freedom-focused civic order. However, he underestimated A, the degree to which that new civic order would be extolled and expanded by the GIs during their own turn in power. B, how during their turn in power, GIs would concentrate on one program in particular as the great insurer of American individual and community well-being, and C, what problems would ensue as a result. If the New Deal produced one piece of legislation of lasting import to the American framework, it was the Social Security Act, signed into law by FDR in August 1935. Well known today, Social Security established a financial support structure for the poor, the unemployed, widows, orphan children, and most notably, retired elders. As the law which more than any other entrenched social insurance in America's institutions, Social Security would buttress and improve the lives and livelihoods of millions over the ensuing decades. There was a catch, however. No brakes were ever applied regarding how much Social Security's recipient base and payout structure could grow. However beneficial and sustaining Social Security would be for individuals, its impact on America's civic culture and upon America's founding virtues, in particular the generational compact, would tell a very different tale. The growth of Social Security in its early years tells a tale of its own. In 1940, the first Social Security payouts were distributed to 222,000 beneficiaries in the sum of $35 million. 10 years later, in 1950, those totals were 3.5 million beneficiaries and $961 million. 10 years later, in 1960, those totals were 14.9 million beneficiaries and $11.2 billion. The timing of this astronomical expansion was not a coincidence. It paralleled the rise of the GI generation to leadership. Shortly after becoming the first GI to assume the Oval Office in 1961, President Kennedy spoke for the lion's share of his generation's leadership class when he wrote in a memorandum, quote, "A nation's strength lies in the well-being of its people. The Social Security program plays an important part. It cannot remain static. Changes in our population, in our working habits, and in our standard of living require constant revision." Unquote. Constant revision is exactly what the GI leadership continued to perform on the Social Security structure during their peak years in power. By 1970, after the program had subsumed GI-devised Medicare and Medicaid, beneficiaries and payouts sat at $26.3 million and $31.9 billion, respectively. The ultimate tipping point for Social Security, however, in terms of its impact upon generations, the generational compact, and American life itself, would be 1972. In that year's Social Security amendments, Congress approved a 20% across-the-board benefits increase for program recipients, as well as a cost of living allowance, COLA, adjustment on payouts to take effect in 1975. What had once been a program providing nobly directed social insurance to the truly needy was now providing a standard of living to most of its recipients instead. Compounding this, the COLA adjustment was improperly calibrated. It caused payouts to increase at twice the rate of inflation. The net result? By the end of the 1970s, Social Security payouts would exceed $100 billion annually. The beneficiaries of this social safety net turned standard of living instrument were, predominantly, the like-aged peers of the leaders who passed the changes into law. As President Jimmy Carter spoke of a national crisis of confidence in 1979, millions of his own generation, the GIs, were retired, collecting Social Security, and living in seniors-only communities. Many of these communities were located far from younger people, including the GI's grown children, by design. There had been generation gaps before. There had been generations that benefited from federally supported pension benefits in old age before. There had been generations that in old age had conspicuously withdrawn and felt alienated from younger people before. But never before in American history had a generation effectively separated into its own, hermetically sealed culture thanks to a combination of institutional largesse and values disagreements with other generations. The seeds of this, however, had been planted many years prior. The GIs had been conspicuously protected unraveling children, encouraged to be dutiful achievers and to see themselves as individually and collectively special. Sound familiar? As the GIs came of age, they saw the most resounding and transformative governing consensus of the 20th century change the institutional rules in their favor. As the GIs came home after defeating the Axis powers, they received generous exemptions and subsidies courtesy of the GI Bill. Tuition payments to attend four-year colleges or complete their educations, low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans to start businesses, up to 1 year of unemployment compensation. The GIs had resided in single-family home suburban tracts heavily comprised of like-aged peers after World War II. and they had been the principal generation behind the creation of a booming middle-class economy the likes of which the world had never seen. Optimism and service and civic leadership and achievement had dominated the GI's life story. So had generational self-interest to the point of entitlement. It is my contention that at the heart of that entitlement was a change consummated when the GIs were young. The shift from liberty to freedom as the American institutional and social framework's first principle. As the civic-focused hero generation that came of age when ensuring against want and fear superseded supporting community voluntarism as American institutions' primary purpose, the GI generation expanded the edifice of this institutional framework until they were insured from want and fear as no generation that came before. The cost to the generations who followed them would be described thusly by Strauss and Howe in The Fourth Turning. Quote, having inherited from their own parents an economy with vast excess capacity just waiting for youth to harness it, the GIs began to pass on to their own children a fiscally overloaded economy unable to afford a new public agenda. Unquote. A generation which since its youth had seen government as its great benefactor, ensured as it entered its twilight that government would be a benefactor to the old at the expense of the young long into the future. I'm sure many listeners are surprised by this focus on the GI generation. What about boomers? Weren't they the ones who rioted? Weren't they the ones who denounced the system? Haven't they done everything possible as a generation to shore up their own living standard regardless of the good of future generations? The answer to all of these questions is yes. We should be mindful, however, that long before boomers had their turn at the wheel, the GIs inherited a government which served their interests, and subsequently used that government to solidify their station at the expense of the generations coming behind them. In the latter respect, boomers, ironically, have followed a precedent set by their own parents. The GI generation's passage from the distinct civic outlook of their youth to the social insurance expansion of their midlife to the seclusion and entitlement of their old age locates them as the vanguard of the decline of the generational compact in America. This decline, and the drifting apart of America's generations that resulted and continues to this day, has brought many lasting consequences. The decline of the American generational compact did more than damage intergenerational shared investment in America's future. It also occurred in parallel to conspicuous and alarming declines in Dr. Murray's four founding virtues, and, not coincidentally, the decline of America's civic culture generally. These parallel developments should not surprise, for the connective tissue between generations in a society is reflected in much more than the public policies passed by its leaders. It is also reflected in the actions individuals, families, and communities take every day to be socially engaged and mutually invested in a common well-being. Whatever the cause, a decline in this kind of accord between people of different ages has a hollowing out effect. When elders are able to seclude themselves from the day-to-day concerns of younger people, the impact of their stewardship over community life diminishes enormously. When midlifers don't attend meetings on public matters or join outfits like the PTA, the decisions of progressively fewer people determine the direction of community affairs and schools. When young adults can't find stable, well-paying jobs or buy homes, either on a timely schedule or at all, fewer families form. When fewer families form, fewer children are born into stable and happy circumstances, and community institutions and services oriented around children and families are strained. When children grow up in non-intact families or in communities bereft of frameworks that support them, they grow up less confident, less well-adjusted, and less healthy. In communities where weak social ties combine with isolation, economic want, or both, property values face decline, and vacated properties, crime, and violence often proliferate. Where these trends persist, already weak social cohesion withers further, and the spiral of entropy accelerates. Social capital, defined as networks of relationships among people characterized by neighborliness and civic engagement, has undergone an enormous decline in America in recent decades. The two most authoritative chroniclers of this decline have been Charles Murray and Dr. Robert Putnam. In his seminal 2000 work, Bowling Alone, Dr. Putnam presents the following findings. From 1960 to 1997, the average membership rate aggregated from 32 national chapter associations fell nearly 50%. From 1960 to 1997, the percentage of parents with children under 18 who were members of a PTA fell 61%. From 1963 to 1998, United Way contributions as a percentage of personal income fell 55%. From 1973 to 1994, the percentage of adults who attended a public meeting on town or school affairs in their community fell 35%. From 1975 to 1997, the number of occasions per year people reported entertaining friends at home fell 45%. From 1977 to 1999, the percentage of married adults who, when surveyed on the statement, "Our whole family usually eats dinner together," answered "disagree," increased 69%. Continuing with declining social capital indicators, Dr. Murray presents these findings drawn from the white working class in Coming Apart. From 1960 to 2008, according to the data collection firm IPUMS, the percentage of households featuring a breadwinner working at least 40 hours per week fell from 81% to 60%. In 1960, the marriage rate among ages 30 to 49 was 84%. In 2010, the marriage rate among ages 30 to 49 was 48%. In 1974, for every 100,000 adults between ages 18 and 65, 213 were imprisoned. In 2004, 957 were imprisoned. Again, these numbers are drawn from just the white working class, but the social trends they speak to date over the same basic time frame as those from Bowling Alone. The social capital indicators from Bowling Alone and Coming Apart all commenced their downward trends in either the 1960s or 70s. Given what has been said so far about the GI generation's role in the decline of the generational compact, it seems worthwhile to ask this question. If the seeds of the decline of America's generational compact were planted well before the 1960s, then why didn't the negative trends cited by Murray and Putnam begin earlier? The answer? Because in the course of a saeculum, social capital declines when social order declines, and the awakening of the 1960s and 70s was a time of falling social order. During a saeculum, when demand for social order is high, the dominant social mood impels each generation to perform their social role in a manner which serves a constructive public purpose. The social moods of crises and highs typically impel generations to not only recognize the perceived need for social order, but to put aside their differences with each other in deference to that need. The social mood of an awakening does not. As a result of the dramatic drop in the demand for social order an awakening brings, social tensions which had lain largely dormant during the prior crisis and high suddenly burst to the surface. As emphasis on the individual progressively supersedes emphasis on the group, people increasingly follow their own inclinations, social pathology rates tick upward, and age-divergent perspectives on emerging values in the culture create intense generational frictions. This combination of generational frictions and the drop in demand for social order does not necessarily produce an equally dramatic reduction in social capital. But, in a society where the institutional and social framework is directed towards satisfying the self-essence of each individual, rather than solidifying and intertwining the self-agency of all individuals, a reduction in social capital is exactly what should be expected when social order declines. Compound that decline of social order with generational frictions in a context where the society's generational compact is itself in decline, and the decay of social capital becomes almost inevitable. This is what happened in the 1960s and 70s. This is why America's social capital declined during the last awakening as it had in no awakening before. This is why the civic culture forged out of America's founding has never been the same since. This is why America's generations have continued to drift further and further apart. As America's generational compact goes, so goes nearly every aspect of our common social fabric. All around us today, we see that America's social fabric is in the closest thing to tatters it has been in our history. After the decline of violent crime, which began in the early 1990s and stretched on for more than 20 years, America's largest cities are seeing their rates of violence increase again. Many large and mid-sized cities, particularly on the West Coast, have in the past several years declared states of emergency over homelessness. According to polling by the General Social Survey, Nearly one-third of Americans in 2015 reported that they had never interacted with their neighbors. From 2005 to 2014, the home ownership rate among people ages 24 to 32 fell from 45% to 36%. In a related development, student loan debt has more than doubled in the past 10 years and now sits at $1.6 trillion. According to the CDC, from 2007 to 2017, total fertility rates within the three major population concentrations, rural, small metro, and large metro, all declined between 12 and 18%. And mass shootings continue to reoccur on an almost weekly basis. Perhaps the ultimate grim indicators of a tearing American social fabric, however, are the rates of death by drug overdose and suicide. According to the CDC, from 1999 to 2017, the age-adjusted rate of death by drug overdose in America more than tripled, from 6.1 deaths per 100,000 people to 21.7 deaths per 100,000 people. Incredibly, the age-adjusted rate increased by a whopping 9.6% from 2016 to 2017 alone. Although CDC data indicates 2018 brought a reduction in drug overdose deaths, the same could not be said for suicides. In fact, 2018 saw an increase in the suicide rate in America for the 13th consecutive year. From 1999 to 2017, the age-adjusted suicide rate increased 33% overall, and suicide rates for the 15 to 24 age demographic are at or near all-time records. The time horizon for when these sad trends begin to turn around is anyone's guess. That they are touching young people as much as any age group is a dark and poignant indication of where things stand. One of the axioms Neil Howe has stated often in recent years is, every generation can be defined by what it just barely cannot personally remember. Put another way, every generation's location in history gives it no first-hand experience of a turning, of a social mood, of a historical problem the generations just older recall well, and that this, in turn, has significant consequences for how every generation goes on to shape history. Much of our discussion has focused on the singular impact the GI generation had on the transformation of America's institutional and social framework in their time, thanks to their location in history. Naturally, then, we should look to today's hero generation, the millennials, for clues as to how the American framework will be transformed in the months and years to come. To do this, it behooves us to consider millennials' unique historical perspective, both in terms of what they remember and what they do not recall. What can millennials not recall, historically speaking? Many things, but one historical reference of surpassing significance: the Cold War. As a generation, millennials possess no first-hand recollection of the tyranny America committed itself to opposing in the second half of the 20th century. Millennials only recall a time of multipolar world order in which America's purpose and objectives have been hotly debated, and a time in which America's social capital has decayed, its civic culture has corroded, and its founding virtues have increasingly diminished. The result is that today's hero generation holds, at best, a murky sense of the distinction between the truly regrettable parts of America's past and the traditions of America's heritage worth preserving. To better understand this situation, we need to probe deeper into millennials' collective life story. The first wave of the millennials, a group which includes the cohort I am a part of, was born in the early to middle Reagan years. By the time the oldest millennials were taking history, rather than social studies, classes in elementary school, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse and the Berlin Wall was a fading memory. Relentlessly taught to be dutiful, conventional, achieving, team-oriented, and concerned with egalitarian sensibilities of fairness, millennials, as a generation, were taught that American history is a long tapestry of inequality, injustice, and oppression. Countervailing perspectives, or serious critiques of alternative governing structures and value systems, were seldom, if ever, presented. These lessons and messages continued to surround millennials through the bulk of their education, especially for those who moved through the humanities disciplines on America's college campuses. Small wonder, then, that as millennials have moved deeper into young adulthood, amid a crisis era, they have applied those lessons and redirected those messages to not only change the tenor of the national dialogue, but to shift the fundamental ideas about what kind of country America should be. Relegated to a lower standard of living than earlier generations by student debts and ever-increasing costs of living, navigating a top-heavy job market with a broken apprenticeship system offering few paths to stability, millions untethered to spouses or committed partners, in a time of extreme partisanship, political dysfunction, and low social trust. In short, increasingly bereft of purpose, solid footing, and transcendent faith. It should come as no surprise that millions of millennials are looking beyond America's traditions for solutions to solidify their future. A series of Gallup polls conducted in 4 of the 5 national election years since 2010 reveals the contemporary 18 to 29 age demographic is solidly pro-socialist, favoring socialism at between 49 and 55% each year. A 2019 poll conducted by YouGov and released by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation reported the number of Americans ages 23 to 38 who answered they viewed communism favorably as 36%, marking an 8 percentage point rise among the 23 to 38-year-old age demographic on that question in just 1 year. In the same YouGov survey, 20% of Americans ages 23 to 38 responded they were extremely likely to vote for a socialist candidate. Most astonishing of all, when the same survey asked Americans ages 23 to 38 whether or not they believed the Communist Manifesto was a superior guarantor of freedom and equality to the Declaration of Independence, 19% responded yes. So now we come to the heart of the matter. Today, in 2020, an entire saeculum has passed since the present American institutional and social framework was forged. That framework, orchestrated around ensuring the self-essence of the individual, on freedom rather than liberty, has overseen the slow degeneration of the national civic culture, America's founding virtues, and our generational compact. Apply cause and effect however you see fit. The stark reality of our situation remains the same. Extreme disenchantment with the American framework is moving from the margins to the mainstream. And, as anyone who has been following the news or on social media in recent months knows, rancor between generations, something largely uncharacteristic of crisis eras in America's past, is now being openly expressed. Today's generational constellation, a remnant of other directed silence deep in old age, proselytizing boomers as the dominant elders, blunt Xers in midlife, civic-focused millennials as young adults, docile homelanders in childhood, has given this crisis mood its distinct character. As the hero generation among that constellation, however, it is millennials who are the dominant generation influencing the direction America takes through the rest of this crisis and into the future. At this point, it is not necessarily an encouraging picture. It is of course impossible to know for certain what the Founding Fathers would say about our present troubles, or what their intuition would foresee as the ultimate resolution of our crisis. But I imagine, if Benjamin Franklin were here, today, he might have said something like this. A society in which shared virtues are not recognized and generations do not keep a compact with each other sustains neither liberty nor freedom. I promised in the beginning of the podcast I would refrain from offering my opinions on solutions to big social and political problems, and I will keep my word here. I would be remiss, however, if I did not offer some general thoughts on next steps. However you as a listener assess the case I've made here, and I look forward to your comments, I think there is general agreement America's generational relationships are in urgent need of serious repair. Recognizing the need for reduced generational discord is the first step. From there, I would advise considering the host of generational differences you see and experience in your daily life, then applying them as a means for dialogue. If you have a chance to engage anyone in a conversation about generational differences, have one. If you know someone of the silent generation, a parent, a grandparent, an extended family member, ask them what it was like to grow up during the Great Depression and World War II. What do they remember? What was it like? Do they see similarities between today's crisis and the crisis of their childhood? If you have boomer aunts, uncles, parents, or grandparents, understand that their basis for what defines a tumultuous time in American history was the 1960s and early 70s, when they were young. Listen to their stories about that time, but don't let them convince you that you had to be there. If you have Xer friends or relatives, understand that their perspectives are being conspicuously overshadowed amid the media coverage of the OK Boomer young versus old discord. Ask them about where they want to see this country go, and why. If you know a lot of millennials in your life, understand that they are the way they are for a reason. Whether or not you agree with their points of view or their lifestyle habits, they didn't turn out as they did by accident. Ask them whether they are living the kind of life today that they envisioned 5 or 10 years ago. If their answer is no, ask them to expand on it, and make note of the expanded answer. If you know Homelander kids, ask them what they're learning in school about American history and what they think about current events. How do they feel about everything that's going on? This is just a sample of conversations we can all have in our own lives to bridge the generational differences which are now so apparent. Is that a substitute for a repaired, healthy generational compact? No, but it would be a start. And a start we most certainly need. I close with Charles Murray's conclusion to Coming Apart, an offering of how Americans may achieve the necessary coming together. Quote, "What it comes down to is, once again falling in love with what makes America different. That requires once again seeing the American project for what it has been. A different way for people to live together, unique among the nations of the earth, and immeasurably precious." Unquote. Please tune in to the next episode, The Breaking Up of Men and Women in America. Thank you for listening.